Hello and welcome to moc103, an introduction to Mocha. My name is Christoph Zappletal and I'll be your teacher for this course. I myself am a visual effects artist and I use Mocha quite a lot in my daily work with Flame and Nuke. But whether you're coming from an VFX, a motion graphics, an editorial or a grading background, Mocha can help you speed up your work in at least two key areas that you will have to tackle in each of these fields, tracking and roto. And while there are other things Mocha can do as well, such as object removal, plate generation, and camera analysis, this introductory course will focus on the first two disciplines, because mastering tracking and roto in Mocha is not only the foundation for the more advanced techniques, it is also what, in my experience, you're going to spend 80 to 90% of your time doing. But before we head into Mocha, let's talk a little bit about the various flavors of Mocha that exist. So if you've got a current version of After Effects installed on your machine, then you already have a version of Mocha installed as well. That version is called Mocha AE and gives you the basic functionality for tracking and masking. Then there's Mocha Pro, which offers you the aforementioned more advanced features and runs as a standalone version as well as a plugin version for various host applications from Avid to Nuke to Flame and so forth. For the majority of this course, I'll be using the standalone version, but we will do a class on the various workflows between Mocha and a couple of host applications where we will also use the plugin version. In the end, it isn't that much of an issue, as Mocha's interface is the same throughout, whether you're using Mocha AE or the plugin or the standalone version. Your experience should be pretty much the same, and if there are any important differences, I'll make sure to point them out. And just to paint the whole picture, the Mocha tracking engine is also implemented in various other Boris Effects products in a stripped-down version. So for example, you can use the Mocha tracking engine in the Sapphire plugins to track your effect, or you can use the Mocha tracker inside of Silhouette in various capacities. Before we delve into the UI and start setting up our first track, let's just quickly discuss what Mocha is and what it is not. So Mocha, by definition, is a planar tracker, which means it is designed to track a planar surface rather than an individual pixel, like a traditional point tracker. Tracking a plane rather than individual points has got the great advantage that it can tackle certain disruptions far better than a point tracker, so it'll be less susceptible to lighting changes, partial occlusions, and alike. With that, you'll have to change a little bit the way you're looking at a shot in regards to tracking. Rather than looking for good points to track, you look at good shapes, or to be more precise, good surfaces to track. What Mocha also has is a bunch of great roto tools, and during this course, you'll see how you can take advantage of the tight integration of the tracking and the roto tools to speed up your workflow. So I said in my introduction that I want to point out the major differences between the standalone version and the plugin version of Mocha. And as you might have guessed, one of the major differences is how we import footage into the Mocha app. So we're going to start off with the standalone version. I'm going to fire that up here. And after we are greeted by that little splash screen, we're faced with this big empty canvas here. Now, if you're new to Mocha, your first instinct might be, well, usually I'll find an import button down here in the file menu, and you're right, but you can only import project shapes. This is not what we want. We want to import footage. Now, one thing to understand about Mocha is that it's really clip-based. Each clip has got its own project. Mocha is not a software that treats multiple clips inside a single project. So you'll set up a new project for each and every clip you want to track in Mocha. And that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to select new project, and there you find the import clip option. And actually, this is the only option available to you right now, because all the other fields in here will be derived from the info provided by that clip. So we're going to pick choose. And if you're a premium subscriber, you can navigate to the platform Drone Rush I supplied to you, and select that and choose open. And now all the other buttons come to life. Before you hit OK down here, let's just very quickly examine these, because quite a lot of things can be set up right now. And that starts with the project name. That by default is the same as the clip name. You might want to do that. I personally want to give this a more descriptive name. I'm going to call it moc103 class01. The next thing we need to tackle is this location folder, which is where Mocha is going to save its project file. Now, by default, Mocha will choose the folder where the source clip is coming from and just create a subfolder called results. Now, my file structure works a bit differently, and I imagine yours does it well. So you might want to change this to a more appropriate location. So in my file structure, that would be going back to the project root, choosing application data, Mocha, and then project data, and select that. So down here, we've got the option to set up VR footage or stereo footage. We don't want to do this right now. What we can also do is define a range. So if you've got a really long clip, you might decide to just import a certain frame range into that project. I'm going to leave that on the default by now. And then you've got various parameters like a frame offset, a frame rate, the pixel aspect ratio, and all that. Mocha, as much as possible, will try to derive that from the clip metadata. So if that all works out for you, just hit OK, and Mocha will try and load and cache up this clip. So now let's take a look on how to apply Mocha as a plugin from inside a host application. For this example, I fired up Nuke, but this host application might be anything from Flame to Avid to After Effects to Resolve, you name it. And the mechanics on how applying Mocha works pretty much depends on the way your host system works. For example, Nuke is a node-based compositor, so I'll find the Mocha effect as a node. If you're working inside something like Avid or Resolve, the mechanics will be slightly different. However, in essence, if you know how to apply a plugin or effect in your host application, then you know how to apply Mocha once it's installed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the Mocha node from my little sidebar here, select it, and I'm just going to connect the source input because we're not doing an insert right now. And then you're getting this very reduced controls on the side. And the only button you really need to take care of right now is to launch the Mocha UI. And what happens now is you get that splash screen like we did with the standalone version. The difference is we already see in the background our footage applied. And if we forgo the splash screen, we see exactly the same layout as we did before, but everything in regards to the clip and all the metadata is supplied by the host application. You'll also notice that we don't have to choose a save location or a project file or anything like that. That's to be expected because that is all handled by the host application, in my case, Nuke. So as I said before, it doesn't really matter whether you stay in the plugin version or the standalone version of Mocha Pro, as the UI is exactly the same between both versions. And the UI is what we're going to take a look at next. So by default, Mocha ships with 4 UI presets. The one it starts up with is the one we see right now, which is called Essentials, and you can change them up here. So the Essentials workspace is really a stripped down version of the Mocha UI. So you get what the name implies. You get the essentials. You can set up a shape, you can track it, you can manage your shapes here in the layers menu, and you can define what kind of motion you want to track. And that's about it. Much more sophisticated and loaded comes the classic workspace, where you've got an enhanced toolbar, you've got all kinds of properties for layers and edges, you've got a lot of parameters organized down here in various tabs. We're going to take a much closer look at some of them in the remainder of this course. You also get much more sophisticated controls down here. So you can set in and out points, you've got more control over the playhead. So for example, if you want to, you can have a loop behavior. So when the clip reaches its end, it starts back from the beginning. You can change that to a once behavior, so that once the clip reaches its end, it just stops. And you can change it to a ping pong behavior where once it reaches the end, it plays back in reverse. So whatever suits your needs. And you've got the current frame indicator. You also got keyframe controls down here, which we also will take a look on a little bit later. This classic workspace is the one I want to spend most time of this course in, but you can change to any other workspace, whichever you prefer during the course. So let's take a look at the remaining two. We've got the big picture, which is essentially that, a big picture. So most of the UI is gone. And this is really for when you want to do granular masking. But if this is a little bit too stripped down for you, you still have got the roto workspace, which leaves you the layers control on the side, which makes sense if you're doing elaborate roto with many shapes. So with that being said, let's go back to our classic workspace. And as you can see, there are shortcuts assigned to each one of those. And you can also, once you're familiar with the UI, customize these. But for the remainder of this course, we're going to stay in the classic workspace and we're going to use these settings and not customize them in any way. So you should be able to follow along. The next thing I want to take a look at is basic navigation. So if you want to pan around your picture, you've got two options. You can either use the middle mouse button. If you press that and hold, you can pan your picture like that. Or if you hit X on your keyboard and press your left mouse button, you can do that as well. If you want to zoom, you can hit the Z key on your keyboard and zoom in and out of that. And a nice trick is if you hit and hold Z and double tap with your mouse or pen, then you get your whole picture framed. So that's quite nice to know. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at creating shapes. And this is more important than you might even think, because we don't only need shapes for roto, we also need them for tracking, because as I said, Mocha is a planar tracker. You might also say it's a shape tracker because we are tracking shapes instead of points. So in order to track something, we need a proper shape. And let's say we want to track the front side of that container. So basically, you've got two types of shapes when you're working inside of Mocha. You've got the X-spline and the Bezier. We're going to take a look at the X-spline first. To create one, you have to click this little icon with the X next to it, and then your cursor will change into a crosshairs, and you can start putting down points of your shape. So once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. And to close off the shape, just click once more on the first handle that you started your shape with, and that way you have got a closed shape. So hitting Z, I'm going to zoom in here, and you're going to notice one of the key behaviors of an X-spline shape, and that is that you already got these round curves here. The way you control the tension of this curve is this handle. If you're not familiar with B-splines or X-spline shapes, this might take a little getting used to, but it's really handy because you can really finely define your curvature. So if I pull that in, you see how that almost turns into a really curve. And if I pull that handle to the extreme, I get a really sharp edge with really hard tension. So that way you can really define the shape you're working in. For tracking, I almost exclusively use X-splines just for convenience sake, but you can of course also change to the Bezier. Before we do that, I want to point out one thing. The moment we created that shape, we also created a layer. So that layer contains that shape. And it's important to know because we can add additional shapes to a single layer, something we will explore a little bit later on. For now, let's just rename this to X-spline, just so that we know which is which. To illustrate the behavior of the Bezier shape, I thought we'd draw up one right up here on that rooftop. So I'm going to zoom in there, holding down the Z key, panning up a little bit. And now I'm going to choose my Bezier tool and create that up here. And notice that when I pull out those handles, those directly influence the curvature of my line pretty much like a node graph editor would. And I'm gonna leave that a little bit curved just for us to modify after the fact, which we'll do in a minute. So I'm gonna pull up a fourth point down here. And just like with the X-spline, I'm gonna close my shape by hitting up on the very first point I created, like that. So now you can see we've got this little selection box around here. Just pay notice of that because that might influence which tangents you're gonna handle. Also, it leaves you the opportunity to handle the whole shape, so you can scale. If you select a point, you can actually move those. However, the behavior is not quite consistent, as you could see, because now it selected 2 points, but with the scaling, it selected all 4. So play around with that a little bit. So I'm gonna take note that nothing is selected, and then I'm gonna pull in on my point, and now I'm gonna drag that in, and I can try to align these as much as possible, but with that steep of an angle, I'll certainly run into problems aligning those. What I need to do though, to really make those work, is really break these handles to get a really sharp edge here. And to do that on the Mac, I just hit the Command key and my cursor changes to this white box with an arrow. And that way I can drag those in individually and model this much better than if I try to do that with an unbroken handle. So as you can see, if I don't select that tool, if I don't hit Command, they still behave in unison like that. But if I hit down Command, I can adjust that angle individually. So I'm going to pan over here, adjust that, bring that point in a little bit more, break that handle, and bring in that point. So that way you can adjust your Bezier shape. In regards to the tracking functionality, both do exactly the same job, and it's up to you which you pick. There are a couple of more ways you can create a shape in Mocha, and I want to illustrate those to you as well. So the first one would be that you can actually paint a shape. This would be pretty much useless on a very rectangular object like the container here. However, for more organic shapes like this stone or little island here, this might come in handy. So if we zoom in there and just select that brush here, you can see we've got that here. We can change the radius here. We can make it smaller or bigger and just quickly paint ourselves a mat, which will Mocha then, once we are finished, convert into a X-spline shape, which is quite neat. So once you're finished, just hit the select tool like that, and Mocha will create a shape out of that. The other way is with the magnetic shape. So let's take a look, for example, here at that beam, and you pick up this tool with a magnet on that side, and you just start in an area and bring it down. And you see, I'm hovering with the mouse right now. And now I'm putting a point down because I think Mocha did a fine job of evaluating the contrast on that line. And I'm going further down like that, up till here. Now, don't mistake this. These points will not necessarily become tangents. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So I'm going to put down another point here. And if something like that happens, if Mocha identifies the wrong area, just head back and set a point before things go awry. As I said, not every one of these points will become a tangent. So don't worry. You can draw that up, especially in an area here where the contrast between the water and the beam is negligible. You'll have to do this a little bit more manually, like that. Like that, like that, and we're gonna close it out here. And as you can see, Mocha did quite a nice job of reducing those tangents. So we're down to 7, I think. Maybe the beam is not the best example, but it illustrates what this can do for you, especially on more complex shapes. This might come in handy. What we also got is some basic geometry, namely in form of a circle and a rectangle. So we can create this as an X-spline or as a Bezier. So let's start with the X-spline, and I'm going to hold down Shift just to make sure that I've got really a square, and I'm going to switch that to Bezier now, once again, holding down Shift, so I get a square. And if I switch between the two, you can see this is the X-spline, so you've got these handles, and you can modify them, of course, after the fact, and they behave like an X-spline would do. And if I go to the Bezier, those will behave like a Bezier does. So I'm going to undo that. And the same goes with a circle. And once again, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, find a place where I can demonstrate this, like here. Once again, if I hit down Shift, I'll get a perfect circle. If I release Shift, I can create an oval shape. So once again, Shift for the perfect proportions, like that. So that's the Bezier circle. And just to be a completionist, this is the X-spline circle. So now that we got the basics about shape creation down, let's put these shapes to good use and start our first track. So the first thing I want to do is just to kill off all those example shapes that we did. So I'll select them by holding down Shift and just hitting the bin button down here to trash them. And the first thing I want us to track is this little container down here. So we can imagine that maybe your client wants you to clean up the upper part, or wants you to put a decal on the side. So whatever the compositing task ahead, you're going to need a good track for that. So let's move a little bit down the time range to somewhere around here, frame 800. And we'll zoom in here. And we're going to use an X-spline to create our first shape. And as you will see, I'm going to put this here with a lot of margin. And that is not because I'm sloppy. On the contrary, this is by design, because this is a shape designed to track this plane, and we want to give it some surrounding so that we got a little bit of an additional edge and info there. Because if I would put this really tightly just around this area, I'll run into trouble, because this pattern of the container is constantly repeating itself. So add in this little margin, and it's a distinction I want to make really early on. You'll create tracking shapes in a much different fashion than you'll create rotor shapes. So never try to make a shape that does both tracking and rotor. It'll fall on your feet very, very soon. So this is a tracking shape for that container. So let's name it accordingly, container track, like that. And before we track, let's just take a look down here at the tracking parameters. So we'll leave all of them on default, but I just want to very quickly explain some of them to you. So you can either ask moc103 to use the luminance of all channels, or by choosing auto channel, it'll switch through the RG and B channels and look for the one that works best for it. Minimum % of pixels used is how much of the pixels contained within the shapes moc103 is going to try to find in the next frame. And then you've got the checkboxes here for which kinds of motions moc103 is trying to track and to apply to its shape. So those are translation, X and Y. You've got the scaling with the Z. You've got rotation. You've got shear. So those are the standards that it expects to track and apply to a shape like this. Then there's the perspective. You might think with a shape like this and the movement that we want to use perspective tracking to apply a proper perspective, but actually this can mess up your track quite often. So I make it a good working practice to start just with the shearing. The mesh option is only available to you when you've got a Mocha Pro license, and it's something that we'll explore a little bit later on, which is basically an additional subplanar layer of tracking that you can use for organic shapes like skin or cloth. Up here to the side, we've got the kind of motion to expect. In most cases, you'll work with large motion. Small motion is really like for stabilizing very fine irregularities. The search area, we'll leave that on auto, but if you've got a difficult track, you can define it here. The mesh generation really doesn't apply to us because we haven't got the mesh selected. As I said, we'll explore that in a later class. So with all that set up, I think it's a good time to start our track. So for this shape to track, a couple of things need to be in place. Firstly, the cogwheel up here in the Layers tab needs to be on. If that is switched off, shape will not track. Mocha will not consider if the shape is selected or not. That is totally irrelevant. It'll track every shape that has got the cogwheel switched on. So make sure it is on. It should be on by default. The second thing is it won't track if you just hit the play button. Those are really just player controls. You need to use these buttons. So you can either ask Mocha to track a single frame in any direction, like so. And you can ask it to track until the end of the clip, or if you stop the process, or Mocha isn't able to track anymore. So let's do that. Let's try to track this until the very end of the clip. So as you can see, Mocha is now going through each and every frame, and the tracking speed will of course depend on the resolution of your clip and on the speed of the computer you're working on. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. All right, so let's take a look. What we need to do now, of course, is verify our track. If that really sits in place, it doesn't look too shabby, but we really don't know for sure. For that, we need to switch on our planar surface. What we get then is this little rectangle, and the first thing you want to do is put that into place with 4 sensible corners. Now that's really easy on something like this container. So we'll put this corner up here. We'll put this up here. We'll put this down there, maybe a little bit lower, like so, and this one down here. Now, one thing I want to mention is that you can't really, at least not in this mode of Mocha, animate this. This is the place of the surface, and it should illustrate to you really these corners. And maybe one thing to think about this is if you, for example, export a corner pin to your host application to put something here, those are the 4 points you will get. Those are the 4 points of the corner pin you'll export. You'll see that in a later class. But now it really defines the surface we tracked. So now let's scroll through this and we can verify our track, and we see we've got a little bit of drift, and we'll compensate that later on. But overall, this is a track we can work with. It isn't too bad, not at all. So we get a little bit of more of drift once we reach that corner. So not too bad. So let's zoom out a little bit and take a look at what happens when we get to the beginning of the clip, because as I can see, we tracked from frame 800, and Mocha is identifying this for us by making the part of the timeline that is already tracked in this purple color, while the part that is not yet tracked in the red color. So if we scroll to the front, you can see now our shape doesn't track, and you see we've already faced with our first obstacle, which is this little occlusion by the rope. Now we can try to track it with the rope coming in, but we can also tell Mocha to expect an occlusion there by drawing up an additional shape. So go to the very first frame where the rope really occludes the container. give it some margin. So let's say around here, 775, and draw up another shape. Now we're not gonna track this second shape. This is just gonna be a quick occlusion mask. Once again, I'm gonna leave a little bit of margin on the sides. I'm also gonna switch off my planar surface because I don't need it right now. And now another thing, I'm gonna switch off the cogwheel because I don't want to track this shape. This one is gonna be solely hand animated. So I'm gonna switch that cogwheel off. And now I'm gonna step through here and find a couple of positions where I want to occlude this rope. Like so. And I don't have to be too granular about this because moca will not look at individual points, rather it'll look at the whole shape. And we're just telling moca with the second shape where to expect an occlusion. So as long as you don't hide the whole front of the container, you should be very fine. So another thing we can quickly do just to make sure that this occlusion shape doesn't get anywhere in the way, we can constrain it to the frames where we only need it. So as you can see here in the layer properties, we can actually set up in and out points for individual layers. So we're going to do this with this occlusion layer. So we're going to say, you're going to start here on frame 732, like that. And you see now the part in front of that is grayed out. And we're going to go to the very end. And we're going to set an out point here. So now that shape will only be regarded between the in and the out point. So, and now we can switch to our main shape. Maybe one thing to do is also rename this shape and say occlusion rope. And what I like to do is actually give this a little bit of a different color. So up here, now I'm going to choose something like the green, just to differentiate it from my actual tracking shape. All right, so with all that set up, we can now switch back to our container shape. I'm going to go to the last frame we tracked, or rather the first frame we tracked, which is 800. And now with all that set up, we just track into the other direction. So as you can see, now our occlusion shape shows up. That way, our track still holds up in place. Pretty nice. So the steeper that angle gets and the more and more that pattern obstructs with all the bars running down here, the harder it'll be for moca to hold that shape into place. Up until now, it's doing quite a good job, but we will have to compensate for that drift. That is one of the drawbacks of planar tracking, is with these steep angles, you can sometimes run into trouble. So you see that now the shape is going to break apart and actually hit the inside of the container. And at one point, we'll get an error message that moca can't track that shape anymore. Up until there, we were fine. But for the very first few pixels, we'll have to adjust. So there are two more things I want to do with you before we finish off this first class of our course. And this is, firstly, I want to tackle that drift. And secondly, I want us to insert a placeholder so that we can enjoy our first track a little bit more than just with the planar surface. So to tackle the drifting issue, make sure your planar surface is switched on and go to the frame where we started the whole track, which is frame 800. And it's indicated here with this little green keyframe indicator. So we go there. And then we head over to the adjust track module. One thing I quickly want to notice here is this is a new adjust track module introduced in moca 2021. If you're using an older version, or if you're running moca AE at this time, this will look more like this. But the adjust track module is coming in its new form to moca AE as well. So I'm going to stick with the new version for now. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to zoom in. And first, I'm going to bring in my planar surface a little bit more. And then we're going to set up points for all of these corners. To do that, we have to indicate how many points we actually need, and that is given by the transform type. If we just want to adjust for translation, then we could choose to set just 1 point. With a scale rotation, it would set 2 points, with shear 3, and with perspective 4. So even though we did just a translation, scale rotation, shear tracking, we're actually gonna click all of these to get 4 points. And we're gonna set them there, and by default, it'll set the points to each of the corners of our planar surface. Now, these could be anywhere else, but for our tasks, this is just perfect. We want them exactly there. So now you'll notice that we've added on the same place another blue keyframe, and those are the adjust track keyframes. And we're gonna scroll through here, and we'll just look out for any drift and just pull in the points to where we think they're in the right position. And what's really nice, up here in this view, you'll get a close-up of both your reference frame, which is frame 800, and the current frame you're on, so that you can compare easily whether you're in the right spot. So down here, we have to bring that up a little bit. Here. So I'll quickly jump through this and speed up the process a little bit and see you on the other side. So now that I got my track adjusted, I'm gonna set an in point for that layer because we don't see it before frame 501 anyway. And then I'm gonna make a few more adjustments here. Just bring that into place. And if you mess up at any point, you can always use the delete keyframe here or jump to previous or next keyframes. Just use the keyframe controls over here. Another really helpful tool to verify your track is this grid, which aligns itself to your planar surface, but gives you another level to really see any drifting going on, and you can pretty much use those lines to verify whether your planar surface sits in place. So that's a quite nice level of control. However, as I said, to finish off this class and have some fun with this, let's put a really big blatant decal on top of it. We will have a discussion on whether to do the actual insert inside of Mocha or your host application at a later date, but for now, head on over to the insert module. You won't have that available if you're using Mocha AE, by the way. So go over there, and there you can actually choose an insert clip. Now, we won't import anything or do anything fancy here, but Mocha comes with a couple of things pre-supplied. For example, a grid, which might be another nice way to verify your track, but we'll do something fun and use the Mocha logo to put on top of this container. And then we can basically render this. So go to the beginning of that layer, and inside the insert module, these buttons appear instead of the tracking buttons, which are render buttons. So you can render either a single frame or backwards or forwards. And we're gonna render this forwards, and I'm gonna speed up the recording and see you in a bit. So our insert finished rendering, and before we play this back, I just want to quickly point out this button here, which allows you to easily turn off all the GUI elements that are obstructing the image right now. So like the planar surface, the grid, the shape itself, all that. You don't want to necessarily see that when you judge it. So to switch that off, you get this unobstructed view, and you can play this now back. So this concludes this first class of moc103. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope to see you in the next class. If you've got any questions, you can find me on the FXPhD Slack channel. Hope to see you in the next class. Until then, bye-bye.